Today I'm going to talk about compliance, specifically special education compliance.
That's good.
Which brings a lot of emotions, fear, anxiety, but I'm hoping that after today we can talk about it a little bit less, or at least change the dialogue so it is no longer the focus of the conversation. This is an IEP, an individualized education plan for Kira, who has dyslexia. This compliance document is the cornerstone of the federal law, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in the United States, that ensures Kira gets a free and appropriate education in comparison with her peers. For 9 years, I spent over 70 hours a year editing, writing, reviewing, and submitting these documents. Kira says that she has a specific learning disability, that she's in a 15 to 1-to-1 setting, she gets time and a half on her tests, that she'll be assessed 4 times a year on 3 objectives, and that she'll meet 4 goals with 80% accuracy. You can all see the individual needs of this child in this document, right? I see some of you recognize her right away. No? I spent 70 hours writing that document. What about this one? Can you recognize the individual needs of this child in this document? None of you recognize Mr. Wonderful, Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank? I'm being overly dramatic to make a point. My point being is that it is very difficult to actually glean anything meaningful about an individual from these compliance documents. And some of you might argue, but that's not the point of the documents. The documents is for compliance. I could play this same game over and over again with all the individuals you see here. You recognize all of these faces because of their talents, their success, or their genius, not because of their learning differences. And so I would like to make the argument here that maybe we don't recognize an individual in the individualized education plan. And so some of you might be wondering, well, why does that matter? Well, because actually the IEP was the first ever personalized learning concept ever created. In 1975, before words like personalized learning or blended learning or flipped classroom or individualized instruction, before those words existed, the IEP was developed to take into account the individual needs of a child. But as you saw from those documents, it has not caught up with what we know about personalized learning today. In fact, parents report that the IEP is confusing, hard to navigate, not transparent, difficult to understand. In fact, this mother said that it was difficult for her to recognize her own child in these documents. So an individualized education plan that obscures the individual maybe seems like it's not doing all of the job it was intended to do. Teachers also very much struggle with this document. I know from personal experience, but also because my colleagues and I interviewed hundreds of teachers from across the country. 79% of them reported the IEP had very little relevance to their teaching. In another study done in 2012, the majority of teachers said that the IEP had little to do with their day-to-day planning, their daily instruction, or their pedagogy overall. The good news is, we know more about special needs and neurodiversity than we ever have before. Thanks to amazing institutions doing really difficult work in the cognitive and learning sciences, we know more about dyslexia, the autism spectrum, ADHD. We know more about reading, writing, thinking, and learning. In fact, we know that some of the greatest minds of our time have had learning differences. Today, 35% of company founders identify as dyslexic. And individuals like Temple Grandin or Richard Branson actually attribute their different way of thinking to their success and to their profound impact. Unfortunately, though, these realizations and this research has not really been brought to the forefront of awareness in society, and it has certainly not trickled down into our classrooms today. Today in the United States, students with special needs are more likely to be suspended, expelled, get caught up in the juvenile justice system. They are less likely to graduate, and they are less likely to be employed. The achievement gap for students with special needs is wide, and it has not closed in over 35 years. And I'm here to talk about the fact that this document is part of the problem. Literally, when you utter the words special education, this document is almost all that comes to mind in schools and in districts. So I'd like to spread the idea that compliance is not enough. It is not enough to simply fill out these documents. So I'm sure you're asking why, what is the disconnect right now? I'm going to try to break it down for you a little bit. When the IEP was written, it was written as an individualized education plan, meaning a process, a detailed plan of action that outlines or documents the services, accommodations, and modifications that a student should get. However, today, we are viewing it as if it is a product, as if it is an output itself, produced with a result to follow. We believe that if teachers in schools and districts spend enough time writing the IEP, producing the IEP, that the results, in this case, academic and functional outcomes, will follow. And that is simply not true. So much so that many people feel that this is almost a blatant lie. This mother wrote an article in The Atlantic in 2016 calling special education a charade, literally talking about smoke and mirrors, saying that the IEP was one of the greatest pitfalls of our education system today in the United States. The special ed system is so divisive that special ed is one of the most litigated topics in our courtrooms today. Schools and districts spend $90 million on conflict resolution, $90 million, the majority of which is spent on special education that is litigating what is written in the IEP, the words that are in the IEP. What's a little bit more alarming than this $90 million is that there is almost no guarantee. All of that fighting and litigation and filling out compliance documents does not guarantee outcomes. In fact, the research shows that compliance does not equate to outcomes. You could be the most compliant district in the country, and your students with special needs aren't necessarily doing any better. As a family, you can win that litigation, but there is no guarantee that your child will have improved educational outcomes after the fact. Reports have shown that litigation does not ensure measurable outcomes, and that compliance and this process has little, if any, connection to the actual educational improvements of students. Also, to add a little bit of salt to this wound, this process further disenfranchises families and students who do not have the means, the access, the language, the time, the money to navigate the system or advocate for their children. So what are we left with? We are left with a country that is in a national crisis. We cannot attract nor retain special educators. Additionally, we have students who are sitting in our classrooms, the next Aaron Brockovich or Jim Carrey, and their IEPs are being argued over in the courtroom instead of having their talents nurtured in the classroom. Now, I'm not here to say that compliance isn't necessary. We absolutely need to document the law and hold every stakeholder accountable. But what I'm here to say is that we need to change the conversation. We need to stop talking about the word compliance and start talking about other words. For example, tools. Specifically, when I'm talking about tools, I'm talking about resources, technology, knowledge. Many of you have apps on your phone that use mobile technology and geolocation to deliver almost anything to your front door. Some of you have apps that tell you who you should marry. A lot of people now have devices in their homes that use natural language processing and artificial intelligence to play your favorite music, close your garage door, regulate the temperature in your living room. What if we applied that technology to special education? What if we spent $90 million on research and development to apply that kind of technology so that teachers could use artificial intelligence to finish those compliance documents? So maybe they spent 1 hour a year writing IEPs and 69 hours nurturing the strengths of their students instead. What if we used mobile technology to streamline communication and create transparency between districts and parents and families so that they could collaborate instead of arguing about the logistics or what is written in the individualized education plan? What if we used technology to give teachers instant access to the insight and knowledge that is coming out of those amazing institutions? When a child has dyslexia, what if the IEP said, you know what, let's assess your creative thinking skills, or let's assess your ability to strategically problem solve? Or if a child is on the autism spectrum, let's take a look at their pattern recognition or their intense ability to visualize. This story is a fable, but I would like to share it because its sentiment is relevant to my point. One day as a small child, Thomas Edison came home from school and he gave his mother a letter. He said, my teachers want you to read this. His mother's eyes welled with tears as she read the letter out loud to her son. It said, your son is a genius. This school is too small for him. His teachers aren't good enough. Please teach him yourself. Many years later, after Edison's mother died, he found that letter and he read it. And it actually said, your son is mentally deficient. We cannot let him attend our school anymore. He is expelled. Now, Thomas Edison took that letter and he wrote an update at the bottom of it that said, Thomas Edison was a mentally deficient child whose mother turned him into the genius of the century. Now, this fable, it makes me think of a lot of things, a lot of different stakeholders. Particularly makes me think of teachers that spend tireless hours writing IEPs and lesson planning and differentiated instruction. It makes me think of districts who work tirelessly to stay in compliance. But it mostly makes me think of students and the massive potential that is possibly lost in arguing over a piece of paper that documents a process we know is broken. I've spent 13 years analyzing this problem, both in and out of the classroom. My team and I work day in, day out with districts, parents, teachers, and students, and we've come to the fact that the first step is to recognize that compliance alone isn't enough. We really need to change the dialogue and start talking about new words like technology, tools, and resources. We believe that if we start to talk about those other things, that we can truly implement an individualized education plan for every child and carry out the best intentions of the law so that every child can reach its full potential, which is what I believe makes education possible. Thank you.